Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, you know, we normally do provide updates on this every few weeks or so, and of course the reason is because we know historically that in bull markets, holding support on the 20-week SMA is often quite useful in seeing sustained rallies, and in bear markets we tend to just sort of get rejected by the bull market support band. And so we will continue to provide updates to it. Again, to help temper our expectations, we can always look through history and see that it generally does take a few tests before you really see a sustained move higher. But one of the things I wanted to hone in on here is just where are the values currently, and of course we're going to take a look at the market in a little bit more detail. Right now the 20-week SMA is coming in around 19.8k, the 21-week SMA is 21.3k, so it essentially ranges from just below 20k, so 19.8, all the way up to about a $1,400–1,500 range. So it is a pretty wide range, all things considered, especially considering, you know, how tight the range has been at various phases throughout the bear market. So if Bitcoin were to see sort of a plunge here, this would be sort of the first line of defense, I suppose, for the bulls to try to at least hold on to some level of support. Now, we've talked some about the golden crosses and death crosses, so I do want to provide a little bit of an update in this video as well. If we switch this over to the daily time frame and we turn on, say, the 50-day and the 200-day SMA, you can see that we in fact had that golden cross back in early February. And if you remember, what did we suggest back then? We say it every single time, and we'll say it next time too, is that normally when you get a golden cross, you see a short-term sell-off followed by a continuation of the trend, right? Like, we've seen this happen so many times, and it's never really a popular theory because, or, you know, sort of suggestion, because everyone wants to feel sure about what direction the market's going to go. And generally, when you talk about a golden cross, it sort of elicits the emotion of, oh, well, that means things going to go higher. And normally they do, but you typically will often see a sell-off right after the golden cross, right, or going into it. And you can see the market peaked here. We had the golden cross, and then we ultimately sold off. And even if you go to the date that we had the golden cross, you can still see the market fell about another 7% or so after we had the golden cross. And again, you see the cross. We normally see a dump after a golden cross in the short term, followed by a continuation of the trend. Now the trend is up, right? The golden cross, you see that short-term dump. Everyone sort of celebrates the golden cross, right? We're going higher. We normally get a dump. And then you see the continuation of the trend. So this did happen once again. And again, it's not rocket science, right? This is just something we've seen happen many times, right? You get a golden cross, you see a dump, and then you see a continuation of the trend. And you can go back in history and see this play out time and time again, right? Even in 2019, you had a golden cross, but you had a dump right at the golden cross, followed by a continuation of the trend. So it's fairly standard stuff. But in the same way, death crosses, when you see the 50-day go below the 200-day SMA, what happens in those situations, right? Well, normally you see a pump followed by a continuation of the trend to the downside. Now, you can see that the 50-day SMA is starting to roll here a little. Okay, so this trend has certainly lost some of its strength over the last couple of weeks. As you can see, that price action has somewhat stalled, and we really haven't yet seen a continuation beyond what initially came, right? The initial continuation of the trend. And I think there's a couple things to look at in that instance. First, I'm going to look closer here on the daily time frame, but we're also going to switch this back to the weekly time frame as well. One thing to look at on the daily time frame is we've sort of been kind of holding these lows here. Okay, so you can see that Bitcoin has more or less just been bouncing off of these lows. First, it was at 20.4K, and then it was at 21.3K, and then now it's around 22K or so, or it was at 22K a few days ago. Now the sort of this bottom part of this range here is around 22.2. So if we get daily closes below 22.2, then that should send off some warning signs for, you know, for Bitcoin's price.
I don't need.
Interestingly enough, we actually have,
Just
you know, some fairly interesting events coming up here. In the next couple of days, we're going to hear Powell speaking, and I would imagine that markets are going to be hanging on to his every word, like they typically do. And if he gives if he gives markets any reason to rally, then I'm guessing they would take that opportunity. They would jump on that opportunity and at least try to take their swing at a potential move higher, at least in the short term. Not necessarily a higher high, but at least as a starting point, a move back up into some part higher in this range, and of course the range low, or at least the higher lows that we've been putting in so far. Although, on the other hand, if Powell comes out and sort of gives a speech similar to what he's given before, like at Jackson Hole, where he just comes out very hawkish, not really interested, and talking about things from a more dovish point of view, then that could put more downward pressure on risk assets. I mean, at the end of the day, the short-term moves are really difficult to predict, and I'm not going to come up here and say that I know exactly which way these things are going to break, because I certainly do not know. What I do know, though, is that markets will often look for reasons to rally until they're given enough reasons. Okay, we've seen this happen many times, right? Where you'll get, and it goes in both directions, right? So like in bull markets, people have more bad news, and bear markets, people have more good news, and those markets will go on sort of ignoring the other type of news that sort of goes counter to the general trend until they have enough reasons not to, right? So in a bear market, they'll ignore the good news until there's enough reasons not to, right? If the good news just is overwhelming and there's enough reasons to turn things back around, same thing occurs in bull markets. So again, markets can rally until they're given enough reasons not to. And I think the main thing to look for here is, how's Powell going to come out with his speech? Is he going to come out very hawkish and talk about, just sort of, these higher for longer mantra that he's been talking about for a long time? Or does he, talk about potentially pausing at some point later this summer? I do think, a lot of the market participants will be interested in exactly what he has to say. So we're sitting, sort of at the bottom of this channel that we've been in essentially for most of this year. Okay, so again, I moved back up to say sort of the mid part of the range and put us back above 24K. The upper part of it all, probably be up at like 27K or so. But where I think we also need to consider something is, we talked about the golden cross on the daily time frame, right? But there's also the death cross on the weekly time frame. And if you remember, the thesis here is that when you get a golden cross or a death cross, you see the short-term reaction is the opposite of what the cross would imply, but then eventually the idea is you get a continuation of the trend. So again, on the daily time frame, what did that mean? It meant a dump right after the golden cross, right? A dump right after the golden cross, followed by a continuation of the trend to the upside, because the trend was going up. So on a death cross on the weekly time frame, you would sort of say, okay, well, what would happen going into a death cross? So right after that, you had the death cross on the week of February 6th, and then the following week, what happened? We had a nice move to the upside, right? I mean, Bitcoin pumped about 16, 17%. So yet again, you see an instance where the death cross came in, but rather a short-term move to the downside, like a lot of people might expect with a death cross, because as the name implies, it's not the most, not the most joyfully named indicator. You actually see sort of the reverse of what a lot of people would think would happen after you get a death cross, and you actually see a pump right after the death cross. Now the question is what's going to happen now? Because if it follows the general thesis, is that it goes counter to what you might expect in the short term, but eventually you would see a continuation of the trend. Now in this case, the trend to get you to a death cross is down, right? That's the trend that would get you to a death cross. So in the short term, you saw a move counter to the trend after the death cross. And now, of course, the question is, are we going to see a continuation of the trend where it eventually rolls back over to the downside and you get that continuation of the trend that is ultimately what led to the death cross in the first place. Now, unfortunately, with weekly crosses, we don't really have any previous data to really talk about. You know, we can't go over here and look to see what previously happened on prior death crosses on the weekly time frame for Bitcoin and try to assess what that means, because it just simply has never happened. It's never happened. Okay, so you know, it's not the same thing necessarily as what you might look at on the daily time frame, but we can always go and look at, say, the S&P 500 and look to see what has it done on previous death crosses to get an idea of you know, what are some things that you might expect on this death cross here. You can see that, you know, the S&P had already fallen quite a bit. It did eventually go just a bit lower. Now, in the short term, it might have gone. I mean, if you look here, the cross occurred in October of 2008, and in March, the market bottomed. But by October of the following year, you know, the market was already higher. So your 12-month forward return at the death cross was still good, right? Like imagine you had just bought the index at this death cross. Yeah, it might have sucked in the short term, but a year later, you'd have been doing fine, right? I mean, you wouldn't have gotten the bottom, but in the grand scheme of things, imagine you told someone that you bought this death cross over here back in October 2008, and you bought it at, you know, when the S&P was around 900 or so. Do you think they're making fun of you for not identifying the bottom? No, you still made a lot of money, right? Like, that's the point. You still did really well. What about over here when we had a death cross, right? So, in the short term after the death cross, we had a short-term move back into the upside. It wasn't the low, though, right? Eventually, the market rolled over, and we put in a new low. So this occurred in September 2001, and, you know, had you bought the death cross, the price at the death cross, September 2001, you know, by September 2003, so 2 years later, you would have been, you know, back well in the money and trending higher for a while. So, I mean, it really does depend on what your time horizon what your time horizon is, as to whether these things are meaningful to you or not. Perhaps it's worthwhile to take a look at what happened in the 70s. We had several death crosses, in fact. So we had a death cross here in May of 1970. You can see when that occurred. It did not mark the bottom, but had you bought when the death cross occurred, you would have gotten it at around 80, and that would have been in about April of 1970. By August of 1970, so not even half a year later or so, you would have been back at that price and trending higher, although it did not mark the bottom. In April of 74, we had a death cross, and, you know, had you bought at the death cross, that would have, you know, put you buying at around $90, or not $90, just 90, the index at 90, and in May of 74, and then in May of 75, you would have been essentially at the same level. One more pullback, and then we were, you know, back sort of off to the races over here and trending higher once again. So generally speaking, when you get death crosses in the market, in the short term, you know, you can often see pumps in the short term. Historically, at least with the S&P, there has, at least in the last few cases, right, there has been a bit more downside, but over the next 1 to 2 years, it was still seen as a relatively attractive price, right? This is sort of the point that I'm trying to make, is that, you know, in these cases, it did not necessarily mark the bottom when the death cross occurred, but from that level, it wasn't like that much further down, and your forward 1 to 2 year returns were fairly decent, even if the market did trend lower before you actually got to that point and realized. So that's sort of the point. When you look over here at Bitcoin, you know, when the cross occurred, Bitcoin was trading right around the price it was trading at right now, which is around 22.5K. Now, you know, as I've said, I think this year is going to sort of chop up both sides of market participants, both bulls and bears. It's my general expectation for the year. I think some people want it to be a lot more complicated than that, and say it's going to either be down only or up only. But the truth is that, you know, if you look at 2015 and 2019, the years that follow these sort of down only bear market years, were relatively choppy and got both sides wrecked quite handily. And I don't really expect this year to be any different. I think that you're going to see a very choppy market where we're going to wreck both sides, both bulls and bears. Of course, we've started the year by wrecking the bear. So, I mean, this is what's happened. So I think we're going to see a continuation of that for the remainder of the year. You can already tell people are getting relatively apathetic, right? I mean, I don't think there's any there's not really any evidence that people are very enthusiastic about these market conditions. So I do think apathy is somewhat setting in, and generally when this occurs, you just get a really boring and choppy market, and this can last for a while. So that is my general expectation, is that more or less that play out. Where, you know, in the short term, there could always be short-term moves in either direction, but as the year goes on, I imagine we're going to generally be spending it in this sort of range where, like, yeah, like it could go just a bit higher, could go just a bit lower, but I don't really see us, you know, I don't really see Bitcoin breaking out to like 40K or something. I know the echo bubble is sort of a popular narrative, but I also don't see Bitcoin crashing to $3,000 either, like is you know, a somewhat popular narrative as well. It's likely not going to go to either of those extremes. It's likely just going to be a choppy market with deviations in both directions, to the upside and the downside, that is sufficient, or it's enough to get people sufficiently wrecked. And then by the time, you know, we go back to quantitative easing, and a, you know, sort of like a real sustained bull market that can get us to new all-time highs, a lot of people have lost out a lot of their money sort of trying to time the market and you know, think that they know exactly when the market is going to sort of turn around each of these cases, right? Which is just simply very difficult to do. And again, I don't provide financial advice on this channel. I should point that out. But I've said many times, and I will repeat myself again, that, you know, sort of the best thing in crypto that I've done in the past is, and will always continue to be, that a dynamic DCA strategy, not a, hey, let's all time the bottom exactly and time the top exactly. No, historically, a mindless DCA strategy that wins out at the end, in my case, like weighted based on risk. Okay, so that's the whole point of the strategy. Okay, and I just want to remind people of that, because, you know, I think it can be easy to sort of get lost in you know, in trying to time things, right? You try to time the top exactly, you try to time the bottom exactly. These things are very difficult to do. So just remember that as you navigate the cryptoverse, that coming up with some type of a long-term DCA strategy, whether you want to dynamically do it like I do, or do it based on some other method, that's generally the sort of the approach that is working well out and will likely continue to do well as we continue to press forward through time. Okay, so, you know, as far as the gold